Upon these islands is so great a number of all kinds of birds that it is past belief, and especially during the spring when they build their nests. If one goes there, he makes them rise in such vast numbers that they form a cloud in the air which the sun cannot pierce. And to kill them, it is not necessary to use guns but simply clubs, for they are sluggish in rising from their nests. As to the young ones, they can be taken as many as wished, even to loading the boats, and the same with the eggs. Nicholas Denys, 1672.
Before we head out, do you have any words of wisdom for us?
Well, the idea of making it interesting and storytelling is, I think really important, because scientists tend to get nerdy and get into all the sort of details of their research and the work that they're doing, and most people glaze over when they see bar graphs and statistical models. So no pressure though.
When I first got this job, it felt like I'd won some sort of a contest. On the other hand, there was plenty of pressure working for the government as a student, not to mention that our assignment was to document bird migration and conservation, yet I didn't know a thing about birds. But after that meeting, the stakes felt even higher. I couldn't seem to shake Saul's words. Somehow we had to find a story to tell, but it wouldn't be easy. The characters would be experts. People who've been conducting field studies and battling for conservation for longer than I've been alive, and the setting would be the vast British Columbian landscape. But I'm getting carried away. This is me, my name's Kieran, and the guy behind the camera is Dustin. We've been given the title of Pacific Flyway Ambassadors, and just this past spring, we set off on a 3,500 kilometer road trip along the Pacific Flyway. Before beginning our trip, I can't say I paid much attention to birds. Sure, maybe the occasional gull and a few pigeons, but since then, a lot has changed. From the way we look at birds to the way we think about conservation. Despite facing many threats, birds are everywhere. But during our trip, we learned that this wouldn't have been the case if it weren't for a monumental agreement that was made 100 years ago, the Canada-United States Migratory Bird Treaty.
Probably my first comment on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is it was created by a bunch of people that are all dead. So to understand the Treaty Act, one has to go back to what were these people trying to do at the time, and what were the problems and challenges that they were facing, that they were looking to solve with the treaty.
The year was 1916. A loaf of bread cost about 7 cents. Canada's population had grown to 8 million people, and our Prime Minister was Robert Borden. The Montreal Canadiens defeated the Portland Rosebuds to win their first Stanley Cup, and D.W. Griffith's latest epic was captivating audiences across the country. Meanwhile, Prohibition was about to become a reality in Alberta and Ontario. Across the Atlantic, however, there were more serious concerns. At the same time, a different sort of war was being waged against migratory birds. Guns such as these, called punt guns because of the type of boat that they were mounted on, could fire over a pound of shot and were said to kill up to 100 birds at a time. These guns were used by market hunters, who killed birds for commercial harvesting rather than individual consumption or sport. The business was lucrative and culturally ingrained, but it started to get ridiculous. There are accounts from parts of Michigan where 50,000 passenger pigeons were being killed every day for 5 months. At the time, women's hats, called millinery, were becoming increasingly stylish and increasingly extravagant. Feathers, and sometimes entire birds, were required for these hats, and as a result, millions of birds were killed, hats and hunting began to take their toll. By the mid-19th century, the great auk had gone extinct. Soon after, the Labrador duck followed suit. Martha, the last ever passenger pigeon, died in 1914. These were just a few of the species that fell victim to market hunting. Something had to be done.
Dear United States Senator Stone, give ducks a show. We don't want spring shooting. We want government protection. Give us a chance to vote on a treaty with England, and we'll show you a whole lot of Missourians don't cooperate with town dudes who want to shoot ducks on nests. Been told, you as head of foreign committee have the right to let us vote on it. I do not know whether you are a duck shooter, but if you lived here, you'd soon know that birds are getting scarce, and that the slaughter in the spring is doing it. We'll be mighty thankful if you help out the treaty. Joseph W. Linville.
On August 16, 1916, Canada and the United States agreed to a migratory bird treaty. Over the next 2 years, both nations enacted federal legislation committing to the treaty agreement. The treaty consisted of a closed season during which migratory birds could not be hunted, and a 10-year hunting ban on several species. It prohibited the taking of nests and eggs, and even banned the trafficking of migratory birds. It had a profound impact. Market hunting was limited effectively, and over the next 30 years, the abstract idea of conservation had found its way into the spotlight.
Three years after his death, Canada continues to honor famed naturalist Jack Miner. The father of conservation won immortality by luring thousands of Canada geese to his home, creating the first sanctuary where birds could be safe from the hunter's gun. Jack developed a bird banding system, allowing him to trace the migratory routes of Canada geese across North America. The simple address, Jack Miner, Kingsville, Ontario, stamped on each bird tag, became one of the most famous on the continent. Jack ranked among the best-known men of his time. His peers, Thomas Edison, Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, and Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. Seeking his friendship were presidents, prime ministers, and the world's celebrities. Here's Jack with baseball's legendary Ty Cobb. That's it, Ty. Right out of the park. When the Birds of Passage bought return tickets south, Wild Goose Jack toured the continent, spreading the gospel of conservation. In 30 years of lecturing, he packed every major auditorium in North America. As the author of 3 wildlife books and numerous articles, he etched his name into history. In 1943, Miner was awarded the Order of the British Empire by King George VI, who christened him the greatest conservationist in the British Empire. As a lasting memorial, the Canadian Parliament has decreed that each year the anniversary of Jack's birth will be observed as National Wildlife Week. Writer, philosopher, teacher, conservationist, Wild Goose Jack is gone, but his memory lives on. The name Jack Miner soars among the titans of time.
In 1947, the management and conservation of wildlife transitioned from a provincial responsibility, as outlined by the treaty, to a federal undertaking, in the form of the Dominion Wildlife Service, which later became the Canadian Wildlife Service. Almost overnight, a handful of dedicated scientists became responsible for the continued prosperity of numerous species. But with the odds stacked against them, there was one thing that balanced the scale: their freedom. Harrison Lewis, veteran biologist and the service's first director, outlined this sentiment in saying, "I took a great deal of pride and delight in the young men of the Dominion Wildlife Service, who were going into the vast expanses of northern Canada with prospects and opportunities before them, such as have seldom been equaled. With plenty of elbow room, they were not hemmed in by any office routine. They were well trained for their chosen work, and were supplied with the funds, equipment, and cooperation necessary to do it. Aside from the well-trained part, it was easy to see ourselves in the position of the young pioneering biologist described by Lewis. With these encouraging words in mind, we set out on our journey. Because this whole project existed as a celebration of the Migratory Bird Treaty's centennial, we were joined by two American counterparts, Jean and Christian, in the spirit of true international cooperation. Back when we started planning this film, we figured it needed to be done by region, the city, the wetlands, the coast, and so on. But over the course of the trip, we saw firsthand that environmental challenges can't be broken down along clear lines. Like the birds we were following, these issues easily cross all manner of boundaries. As we spent more and more time with experts, we began to notice something else. While the treaty initiated the spread of conservation, the conservation that we encounter today is not possible without two crucial and interconnected practices: monitoring and research. If conservation has a starting point, it's monitoring. In the words of the wise Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Monitoring is about trying to know what you've got before it's gone.
To brush my hair. So how common is a common bird? The birds you see all the time, you have no clue how common they are. So if you were to lose half of them, would anyone notice? And the answer is no. But my job is to notice that.
He notices these things through monitoring, which is the process of counting, tracking, and mapping species. And the best way for him to do so is, fittingly, by flying. Yet it wasn't always this easy, as technology has changed in recent years.
1982, this is what we used. We had field notebooks, Environment Canada. They were bilingual, Carnet de Travail, field notebook, and you have these little square things and you write your data on that. The beauty of these things that they fit in your pocket. Everyone carried them, and people like me have bookshelves that are completely filled with collections of field notebooks. At some point, I guess, we discovered that clipboards existed, so we actually had clipboards with data sheet, and then we went from being able to put data in a pocket to writing things on these different clipboards. Now, after decades of trial and error, is this little machine here, this stuff book. And basically what it has is a series of base maps, of habitat maps in that case, that are contoured. This is the land, and you can see the altitude. And you can actually set beforehand transect, which are these green lines, or you can use them as track logs. It tells you where you are. And each of the blue dots on that map is basically a bird sighting. So we fly all the areas in green, and each of those is a bird recording.
Wetland, 1.2 hectare, mallard male. Wetland, 3+ hectare, Barrow's golden eye pair.
So right now, the technology is such that when we do a bird survey, when I do a bird survey, there is no paper involved whatsoever. Everything is digital. So this is kind of the state of the art of bird survey technology. Basically, I spend all my time looking out the window to look at birds, identify them, and count them.
Monitoring doesn't require every bird flight, death, or birth to be tracked. Instead, every time one of these instances is noticed, the information about a small population sample is expanded to help paint the bigger picture. In Vancouver, we learnt that during each day of the fall migration season, about 70 birds die as a result of window collisions, at my university campus alone. Obviously, this is a way bigger number than most people would guess, and the only reason that anyone notices the deaths is because of monitoring. Knowing more about these collisions can help lead to more bird-friendly architecture and building codes. But this isn't the only way to monitor. In fact, it was easy to see that lots of effort is put into monitoring, and that there are many methods to do so. Several coffees and a few hundred kilometers east of Vancouver, we arrived in the sunny and dry Okanagan Valley, where we learnt that birds can be outfitted with devices that allow scientists to track them over long distances and great periods of time. This answers questions about where birds go and when, something that I assumed would already be basic scientific knowledge, but has often remained a mystery, even to the experts. Rather than seeing the unknown as a problem, however, many of the people we talked to saw it as an opportunity.
One really interesting piece of advice I had was about 10 years ago by one of the senior U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officials in the Pacific Coast, and his comment to me was, what makes you or breaks you in the business of conservation, in bird conservation, is not what you know, is how you handle what you don't know.
So monitoring provides us this baseline indication of how healthy the populations are. Research is more when you ask a question about why.
somebody said, describe your job, I would say, first of all, I have the best job in the world. It would be my hobby if it wasn't my job, so I always feel incredibly lucky that way. So I'm a research scientist, so I conduct research that's important to conservation of seabirds along the coast here.
Along the way, we learned that research isn't always as complicated as it seems. It doesn't always involve white lab coats and beakers. Often, it's just about asking the right questions.
So what are they eating? How does their timing of breeding vary from one year to the next? What are the implications of changes in the timing of breeding?
The answers to these questions are often discovered through the long-term observation and analysis of natural changes. The natural world provides all sorts of variables, and an important aspect of research is determining cause and effect of those variables.
But the birds are very closely tied to the timing of their prey, so they feed on zooplankton. And the time of the year where zooplankton are available to the birds up near the surface of the ocean is very strongly determined by the temperature of the ocean. So in years where the ocean waters are warm, their prey peak much earlier in the season, and so they're incapable of matching their breeding to match the early timing of the prey peaks. As the ocean warms, we expect these mismatches between the birds and their prey to become more common, and their breeding success will be reduced, and over time you would expect to see reductions in population.
In reality, there isn't usually one single answer. Many different variables combine to threaten birds. A phrase we heard regularly was death by 1,000 cuts. That said, many of these cuts are caused by one thing: climate change.
These are exactly the sorts of things that climate scientists are telling us they expect to occur as a result of climate change. So even if we don't attribute these individual effects directly to climate change, it may be giving us a glimpse of the future under climate change scenarios.
It was funny that Mark mentioned the future, seeing as the reason we'd begun our trip was to celebrate the past. Yet the more we thought about this, the more we realized that the treaty itself, and conservation in general, is also about protecting the future.
People are used to listen to conservation on a piece-by-piece basis, so people understand bird monitoring. They do get that we are counting birds and doing that. They also get that we're doing hunting regulations and harvesting. And some people know that we are doing the banding and all of that. But how are bird populations and bird habitat being managed? This is more complicated, and I think there's actually there's probably room there to improve the understanding of the public on how all these things fit together. That for species at risk, we have a Species at Risk Act. We have habitat, for protection of habitat, we have joint ventures. We have groups like Ducks Unlimited that protects wetlands, and we manage that. But all of these activities are really all doing conservation. It's not a coincidence that all these activities take place. And even though they might seem like independent activities, they are not. These things are all tied together.
It took a while for us to finally see it, but Andre was right. As important as monitoring and research are, on their own, they're not conservation. At the same time, without them, you can't have conservation. Given the importance of monitoring and research in the big picture, we kept struggling with the same question. If we're not involved with either of these practices, what role do we play?
In 1982, I was 21 years old, and I worked my first summer out of Williams Lake, and at the end of the summer, I went to the senior biologist at Ducks Unlimited up in the Williams Lake office, and I told him I really care about conservation. I want to have a career in that field. What should I do? And to my horror, the answer that he gave me said, like, Andre, if you want to do conservation, get involved with politics. And that was not at all the answer that I wanted. So I said, like, hold on here. No, I want to be a field biologist.
Traditionally, we've worked within a fairly confined range of disciplines in order to achieve the objectives that we have. And I think more and more there's a realization that the solution, the conservation answers that we're going to need, and the path to conservation is really going to be achieved through all kinds of disciplines.
If you want to do conservation, you can do conservation in very unusual ways that don't require to be wildlife biologists. You can be involved with different social groups or working groups or conservation groups. You can do rehabilitation of animals, and you can basically be a politician, or you can run companies and have like philanthropy activities or stuff like that. There's a million ways that you can deal with conservation.
On the 1,500-kilometer drive back, we had plenty of opportunity to think about what we'd seen and heard. At 1 in the morning, 11 days after our whirlwind trip began, we made it home. We'd thought that the plot of the story would be centered around our trip, and that our arrival in Vancouver was supposed to mark the end of it. Yet all of our footage, our interviews and recordings, our research and discussions, couldn't possibly tell the whole story. The characters weren't just the biologists, researchers, and students that we met along the way, and the setting reached far beyond the borders of British Columbia. We couldn't finish the story because it hadn't ended yet. We'd found a beginning. The Migratory Bird Treaty was an easy place to start, and we'd figured out that conservation was the key theme. But the story is ongoing. 100 years ago, conservation looked quite different. If there are truly a million ways to deal with it, then we all just need to pick one. If we do, imagine where we might be 100 years from now.